Imagine this. You wake on a fog-drenched London street in 1850. The kind of fog that doesn't just blur the edges of buildings, but seems to creep into your lungs, clinging to the back of your throat with every breath. Gas lamps flicker weakly through the smog, yellow halos trembling in the murk. The cobblestones beneath you glisten with sewage and last night's rain, slick and treacherous underfoot. Somewhere nearby, a cartwheel splashes through the muck, and from the shadows, you feel it, eyes. Dozens of them, watching. They say the Victorian age was a time of elegance. A glittering empire wrapped in lace and manners. Afternoon tea, polished manners, and morality so strict it was engraved in rulebooks and whispered in drawing rooms. That's the version written in the polite histories. But beneath that polished surface, there was another world. A hidden London, stitched together with poverty, disease, and desperation. A place where survival often meant selling the only thing left to sell, your body. Let's not rush. Let's walk here together slowly through this world. You hear it first in the distance, the cries of costermongers hawking stale bread and bruised apples. A dog barking, feral, scavenging scraps in the gutter. A baby wails from a tenement window where smoke curls black against the morning sky. London in 1850 is a city swollen with people, over 2 million souls crammed into its belly, many living elbow to elbow in single rooms, breathing the same rancid air. You step carefully past a heap of refuse, and it hits you, the smell. Coal smoke, horse dung, sour gin, the tang of rotting fish from Billingsgate Market. And always, the river. The Thames rolls sluggishly nearby, its surface a dark broth of filth. They call it Father Thames, but tonight he stinks like an open sewer. It's no wonder reformers feared the moral miasma rising from these streets. To them, sin was not only in the heart, but in the very air. And here, yes, here in the damp shadow of St. Paul's, women wait. Some young, faces still soft with the memory of childhood. Some old, worn past recognition. All of them marked by the same unspoken knowledge. They are here to sell what Victorian society pretends not to see. Some stand bold, in painted cheeks and bright shawls meant to catch the eye of passing men. Others linger in the doorways of gin shops, shadows among shadows, hoping for the chance at a few pennies. Now pause a moment. Listen. The sound of boots on wet stone. A man approaches, coat collar high against the chill. Is he a dockworker, hands raw from hauling cargo? Or perhaps a clerk, wages too small to keep a family fed, but enough to buy an hour of escape? Or is he a gentleman, polished shoes splattered with the muck of the East End, out for a night of indulgence he will never confess to in polite society? The truth is, he could be any of them. Because this underworld does not discriminate. Rich or poor, highborn or low, they all pass through here. This is the contradiction at the very heart of the Victorian age. An empire that prided itself on morality and virtue, where Queen Victoria herself embodied domestic purity, also depended, silently, guiltily, on vice. The newspapers scolded, the preachers thundered, the politicians wrung their hands about the fallen women. Yet the demand never faltered. Behind every sermon condemning vice was a man who, perhaps the night before, had paid for it. And so we stand here, at the threshold of the story. The respectable world above, shining with gaslight and etiquette. And the world below, soaked in gin and shadows. They exist together, inseparable, like two faces of the same coin. London in 1850 is not just a city of progress, invention, and empire. It is also a city of hunger. A city of girls barely 12, pushed onto the streets because there was no bread at home. A city of women who once had husbands, now widows, forced to survive any way they could. A city where disease lurks in every embrace, where morality is preached but rarely practiced. This is the dark side of the Victorian age. And tonight, we will walk its streets together. Step by step, you and I will move deeper, beyond the polite curtain of tea rooms and drawing rooms. into alleys where footsteps echoed differently, into brothels, garrets, and shadowed corners, into the lives of those who lived and died in silence, even as the empire proclaimed its virtue. Do you hear the bells of St. Paul's tolling the hour? They remind you, time moves forward even here. Let's follow the sound eastward, into the heart of the city. Because if you truly want to understand Victorian morality, you have to see the world that tried so hard to hide. And so the fog thickens, the lamps dim, and the story begins. The bells of St. Paul's fade behind us, swallowed by the fog. You step carefully, your boots slipping on the slick cobblestones, and with every corner turned, London reshapes itself. One moment, you're passing a row of damp, crooked houses where laundry flaps stiff in the morning air. The next, you emerge into a boulevard so wide and lined with carriages that you'd swear you've stepped into a different world entirely. This is London's great secret. It doesn't exist as a single city, but as dozens layered on top of one another. Poverty pressed against wealth, elegance beside rot, and virtue always trying, and failing, to disguise vice. Look up. On the skyline, domes and spires pierce the fog, the domed grandeur of St. Paul's, the jagged fingers of church steeples, and the pale silhouette of the Houses of Parliament, still fresh from their reconstruction after the Great Fire of 1834. But glance down, at the streets beneath, and you see another London altogether. One where barefoot children scavenge horse dung for fuel. One where women huddle in doorways with shawls pulled tight against the cold, waiting for custom that might buy them a crust of bread. It's like walking across a chessboard where the squares shift beneath your feet. White, black, noblemen and beggars, palaces and slums. The contrasts are so sharp they could cut you. We move east, toward the river, and the air changes. Thickens. You smell it before you see it, the Thames. The Great Stink, as the newspapers would later christen it, but to the people of 1850, it is simply life. The river is both artery and sewer, carrying barges of coal and timber, but also the waste of 2 million souls. On hot days, its stench rolls across the city like a living thing. For the poor who live along its banks, it means sickness, cholera outbreaks sweeping through entire neighborhoods. For the rich, it is an inconvenience, an odor they can escape by retreating to country estates or shutting the windows of their townhouses. Pause here a moment. Imagine you are standing on London Bridge. Beneath you, the water is sluggish, brown, studded with refuse. A dead dog floats past, bumping against a bloated barrel. Yet look around at the bridge itself. Horse-drawn carriages rumbling, gentlemen in tall hats discussing trade, ladies clutching parasols and handkerchiefs to their noses. Above the stink, commerce and chatter carry on as though the world were perfectly orderly. This is the Victorian way, to ignore what festers at your feet so long as the surface gleams. Now follow me westward. The fog parts to reveal the broad sweep of Regent Street. Here the air smells not of sewage but of coal smoke, damp wool, and perfume. Gas lamps arch overhead in elegant rows. Carriages gleam, horses' coats brush to a shine. Gentlemen stride in polished boots, ladies rustle in silks, their crinolines wide enough to block the narrow pavement. This is the London of theatre, of shopping arcades, of opera. It is a world built to dazzle, to remind every passerby that Britain is the heart of an empire stretching across the globe. But the trick is this: walk 10 minutes in almost any direction, and the illusion crumbles. Slip into an alley just off Regent Street, and suddenly you're in the rookery of St. Giles, one of this city's notorious slums. The ground is thick with mud and refuse, the houses crammed shoulder to shoulder. Doors hang open, revealing families piled into single rooms where the damp eats at their lungs. In the gutters, gin bottles glint like discarded promises. Here vice isn't hidden, it's survival. Women call out softly from doorways, offering themselves for pennies. Children dart barefoot between legs, some selling matches, some simply begging. This, too, is London. Just as real, just as alive. Think of it, a city where Buckingham Palace and a rookery stand almost side by side, separated only by a mile or two of cobblestones, yet by a gulf so vast it may as well be another planet. A world where a nobleman might ride to the House of Lords in a gilt carriage, then pass, on the very same street, a girl of 13 offering herself for bread. Do you feel the whiplash? That's the essence of Victorian London. Contrast. Collision. The contradictions don't end with geography. They seep into daily life. Walk into a church on Sunday morning, and you'll find pews packed with families singing hymns of purity and devotion. Yet the same men who kneel piously beneath stained glass may spend their evenings in taverns or worse, buying what they never admit to desiring. Clergymen thunder against sin, newspapers condemn fallen women, reformers publish pamphlets on moral decay. And still, the streets are full. Business continues. Morality shouts in daylight. Hypocrisy prowls by night. Let me show you another street, Whitechapel Road. By day, it bustles with costermongers, carts, shouting vendors, the smell of fried eels and coal smoke. By night, it transforms. Gas lamps flicker, and shadows lengthen. Women emerge from alleys, waiting. Some are scarcely older than children. Some are gaunt, their cheeks hollow from hunger. The men who come here are many: dockworkers fresh from the river, clerks seeking relief, soldiers with pay in their pockets. And among them, occasionally, a gentleman of wealth who has strayed into the East End, cloak pulled tight, hoping anonymity will shield him. It is here, in these contrasts, that the truth of the Victorian city reveals itself. London is not one place. It is many, each bleeding into the other, each feeding on the other. The wealth of the West End depends on the labor of the East. The morality of the drawing room depends on the silence of the brothel. The grandeur of empire is built on backs spent in poverty. In Belgravia, the air is perfumed with lilacs from private gardens, the smoke of well-tended hearths. In Shoreditch, it tastes of soot, sweat, and damp brick. In Mayfair, the cobblestones gleam with the polished shoes of footmen. In Spitalfields, they're slick with blood from the slaughterhouses. And yet, this is all one city. London, the heart of an empire. Ask yourself, how could Victorians hold these two worlds in their minds at once? How could they believe in their own virtue while stepping over the poor? How could they speak of purity while feeding on vice? The answer lies not in one district or another, but in the tension between them. The contrasts weren't accidental, they were the system. This is why the story of prostitution, of the women who filled the streets, the brothels, the shadows, isn't just about vice. It's about the entire structure of Victorian life. Poverty created it. Hypocrisy allowed it. And the very wealth that funded the opera houses and townhouses depended, silently, on its existence. As we move forward, remember the feel of these contrasts. The polished marble of Regent Street beneath your hand, the slime of Whitechapel's gutters under your boots. The clink of champagne glasses in Belgravia, the cough of a consumptive child in a rookery. Because these sounds, smells, and sensations aren't background, they're the stage on which the entire drama of Victorian morality plays out. London in 1850 is a city of splendor and rot. And to understand its secrets, we must walk both its boulevards and its alleys. And so, with the fog thick around us, we turn eastward again. Toward the rookeries, toward the tenements, toward the shadows where tens of thousands of women lived and died. Because now, the question presses closer: just how many walk these streets in silence, trading survival for a coin? Let's step into that world next. The fog thickens as we move eastward, down into Whitechapel, into Shoreditch, into the alleys where shadows grow long and narrow. The deeper we go, the more the city changes shape. The marble-fronted banks and wide boulevards of the West End feel like a dream you once had, fading now that your boots are slick with gutter water and your ears ring with the laughter of taverns. Here, the truth begins to sharpen. Prostitution isn't rare, isn't hidden, isn't some isolated vice. It is everywhere. So common, so woven into the fabric of the city, that you begin to realize London itself hums with the trade. Pause with me here on Whitechapel Road. A line of gin shops flickers in the gaslight, their doors yawning open, spilling out warmth, smoke, and the sour stink of spilled liquor. Women lean against the doorposts, shawls pulled close, eyes scanning the men who pass. Some are loud, bold, calling out in practiced voices. Others are silent, letting only a glance linger long enough to be an invitation. You count 5 women on this corner alone. Then another 3 by the lamppost. Another 2 in the alley mouth. And this is just one street, in one district, on one night. The truth is staggering. By the mid-19th century, London held perhaps 50,000 to 80,000 prostitutes. Numbers so high they seem almost unreal, until you walk these streets and realize how quickly they add up. Every alley, every rookery, every tavern has its share. For comparison, think of this. In some estimates, 1 in every 12 women in London at mid-century had at some point turned to the trade. 1 in 12? Think of every street you've walked tonight. Every house you've passed. Every woman you've glimpsed in the fog. The odds are, at least one of them has known these streets in a different way. And these aren't simply nameless shadows. They are women of every age, every background, every circumstance. Some young, shockingly young, barely 12, sold by desperation or lured by promises. Some older, widows left with children to feed. Some in their 20s, driven from service after a scandal, unable to find honest work. And others still, women hardened by years in the alleys, faces lined before their time, voices roughened by gin and smoke. It is easy, perhaps, to imagine them all as outcasts. But look closer. Many live double lives. A seamstress by day, a streetwalker by night. A laundress in the morning, a brothel worker in the evening. For some, prostitution was survival, a way to patch the holes of starvation wages. For others, it became permanent, because once you'd been marked by it, respectable work was nearly impossible to find again. The city offered little forgiveness. Once fallen, always fallen. Now imagine the scale not just in numbers, but in geography. Prostitution mapped itself onto the city in layers. In the West End, the brothels could be elegant, curtained rooms, chandeliers, women in silks, clients who arrived in carriages. In the East End, it was alley corners, filthy taverns, rented garrets with straw mattresses. In between, in districts like Holborn or Southwark, it spilled into every variety of lodging house, music hall, and cellar. From the docks at Wapping to the squares of Mayfair, the trade stitched itself into the city like a dark thread through every district. And London was not unique. Paris, Berlin, New York, all cities of the 19th century had vast sex trades. But London's scale was different. London was the largest city in the world, the beating heart of an empire, its population doubling and redoubling with migrants from the countryside and from abroad. Poverty spilled into its streets in torrents, and so too did vice. Foreign travelers wrote with shock of how open it was. One French visitor remarked that London seemed to have as many prostitutes as it had lamp posts. An exaggeration, perhaps, but the kind that carries a shard of truth. Now picture this. It's Saturday night. The working week is over, wages are in hand. Men spill into taverns, the streets alive with shouting and singing. And into that noise, the women step. Some carry candles and colored lanterns, a signal. Some wear bright shawls, their color marking whether they are young, old, cheap, or dear. Some lurk in the shadows, waiting for the half-drunken stumble of a man who cannot resist. Multiply this scene by 100 streets, and you have the pulse of London's weekend. Multiply it again by 52, and you see how the trade never sleeps. But let's not only count by numbers. Let's count by consequence. For every woman on these streets, there are mouths to feed. a child left at home with a crust of bread, a husband who abandoned her, parents in the countryside who think she is still in service. Multiply that, too, by tens of thousands, and you realize prostitution is not a fringe of society. It is a pillar of it. Hidden, despised, condemned, but indispensable, woven into the machinery of survival. And the city knew it. The police knew it. The reformers knew it. Even the government knew it. Reports were written, blue books filled with statistics, commissions convened. They all came to the same uncomfortable conclusion: the trade was too large to eradicate. Too deeply embedded in the city's hunger, poverty, and hypocrisy. This is why the Victorian obsession with the prostitute grew so fevered. She haunted sermons, novels, pamphlets, paintings. She became a symbol, both feared and pitied. To moralists, she was the emblem of sin and degradation. To reformers, she was the tragic victim of poverty. To the men who sought her, she was an escape. To society at large, she was both necessary and despised. And so the scale becomes more than numbers. It becomes an atmosphere. Imagine London without them. The streets would feel emptier, the taverns quieter, the shadows less alive. Their absence would be as glaring as the absence of gas lamps. That's how vast the scale was. They were not intrusions into the city. They were part of its very character. Now, let me tell you something chilling. There were guides. Printed directories of brothels, disguised as tourist books. Gentlemen could buy them and flip through pages listing addresses, prices, and descriptions. In other words, the trade was so large, so organized, that it had its own cartography. Imagine London as a map, not only streets and squares, but marked houses of vice, plotted out like constellations. And yet, despite the scale, Victorian society insisted on its silence. Families pretended not to know. Wives closed their eyes to their husbands' habits. Politicians thundered about morality in the House of Commons by day, then slipped into the shadows by night. Hypocrisy was not incidental. It was essential, the glue that held this double world together. So here we are. Standing in a city where tens of thousands of women walk these streets, night after night. A city where every corner has its own whispered bargains, where morality and survival are in constant negotiation. And you begin to realize, this is not just a problem of numbers. It is a problem of causes. How did London breed such vast desperation? What forced so many women, from so many walks of life, into the trade? That is the path before us now. To follow these women back to the roots of their choices. Poverty, hunger, the grinding machinery of class and gender. The next step in our walk leads us not just into the streets where they stood, but into the kitchens, factories, and garrets where their stories began. And so, with the gas lamps flickering overhead, we leave the scale of the trade behind us, and turn to the causes that fed it. The gas lamps sputter overhead, smoke curling in halos, as we linger a moment in the shadow of a gin shop. Behind us, the echoes of laughter and bargaining fade. Ahead, the alleys darken. The question hangs heavy in the air: why? Why so many? Why did London teem with tens of thousands of women forced onto these streets? The answer is not one thing, but many. Poverty. Wages that barely kept bread on the table. Families fractured by disease, drink, or death. Rules of morality so rigid that one misstep could cast a woman out forever. London's prostitution trade was not born of vice alone. It was born of desperation. Let's walk into a tenement now. The door creaks on rusted hinges, and the stairwell smells of damp plaster and boiled cabbage. Up a flight, then another, the boards groaning beneath our weight. At last a room, barely 10 feet across. Inside, a mother sits by the hearth, her face pale in the glow of a dwindling coal fire. 3 children sleep on the floor beside her, curled together under a single threadbare blanket. There's no father. He died last winter of cholera. The mother scrubs laundry for pennies, her hands red and cracked from the lye. She makes maybe 4 shillings a week. Bread, rent, coal, it isn't enough. So what happens when the rent collector knocks? When the coal runs out? When the youngest coughs and needs a doctor she cannot afford? For some women, the answer becomes grimly simple. One night on the streets can buy a week's bread. One night can keep the children alive. Survival first, shame later. And she is not alone. Across the city, thousands of women live this same arithmetic. A servant dismissed for impropriety, sometimes nothing more than being caught in conversation with a man. A seamstress whose wages collapsed when the workshop cut hours. A girl of 14, orphaned, left to fend for herself. For each, the path narrowed quickly. Honest work was scarce, poorly paid, and backbreaking. Prostitution, as brutal as it was, offered immediate cash. And once taken, the path was nearly impossible to leave. Step with me into a workroom. The clatter of sewing machines fills the air, the hum broken by coughs. Women sit in rows, bend over seams, their eyes strained in the dim light. Their pay? A few pence a day. Enough to keep body and soul together, barely. Some work 16 hours, their fingers bleeding from the needle. At the end of the week, they may not even earn enough for rent. And when the foreman leans too close, his hand on his shoulder, his whisper promising extra wages in exchange for favors, the line between factory floor and street corner blurs. Or look into the kitchens of the wealthy. Servant girls, often 14 or 15, rise before dawn and collapse near midnight, scrubbing, carrying, polishing. Their wages are meager, their dignity constantly threatened. A master's unwanted advances could mean ruin. A whispered rumor could cost them their post. Once dismissed, their references destroyed, where can they go? Often there is nowhere but the streets. It is not only wages and work. It is also the cruel mathematics of morality. In Victorian society, a woman's reputation was her livelihood. Lose it, and doors closed forever. For a man, a dalliance might mean little. For a woman, it meant social death. Imagine a young girl seduced, abandoned with child. Family turns her out. No one will employ her. The parish offers no aid. What remains? Only the alleys, the brothels, the garrets. Respectability was fragile. Lose it once, and you might as well be branded. And then there is drink. Gin, the cheap solace of the poor. In the East End, gin shops outnumbered schools, churches, even bakeries. For a penny, you could buy a glass strong enough to burn away hunger for an hour. For a woman already on the edge, gin could soften shame, blur the line between choice and necessity. But it also bound her more tightly to the trade, for once caught in its grip, the need for money became sharper still. Poverty was not the only cause, but it was the deepest root. Statistics from the period tell the same story. The majority of prostitutes came from the working classes, from broken homes, from families too poor to survive otherwise. Some reformers even noted how seasonal employment shaped the trade. In winter, when jobs dried up and food grew scarce, the number of women on the streets swelled. Prostitution rose and fell with the price of bread. Listen closely, and you'll hear another echo beneath all this: class. For middle and upper class women, poverty was seldom the issue. But they, too, could fall. Some slipped after scandal, or after a lover abandoned them. Some, drawn by thrill or boredom, chose the trade in secret, cloaked in anonymity. Yet the vast majority were working class, trapped by an economy that gave women little other choice. The irony? Victorian society preached domestic virtue as a woman's highest calling, yet gave countless women no means to reach it. They were told to be wives and mothers, but the men who might marry them often sought younger or wealthier brides. They were told to be pure, but the labor system exploited them at every turn. And when they stumbled, society offered only condemnation. This is why reformers called prostitution the great social evil, not only for its scale, but because it revealed every contradiction of the age. Poverty, hypocrisy, double standards, they all converged here. And yet, some Victorians chose to look away. The respectable classes could pretend not to see the women waiting in the shadows, could speak of morality as if it were a fortress, impregnable, untouched. But the truth was always there, written in the streets. Imagine yourself pausing now at the edge of Spitalfields Market. The day's trade is ending. The stalls are nearly bare, wilting vegetables, bruised apples, scraps of meat too tough to sell. A girl lingers nearby, clutching a shawl. She is no older than 16. Her father lost work at the docks. Her mother takes in laundry. Still, the rent collector demands his due. She looks at you, and you see it in her eyes. She knows her choices are shrinking to nothing. The market closes, the night deepens, and she steps into the shadows. This was the story repeated across thousands of lives. Hunger, desperation, shame, and a society that offered little mercy. And so, when we speak of the great number of prostitutes in London, we cannot speak only of desire. We must speak of bread, of wages, of the weight of class and gender. Every woman on those streets carried not just her own body, but the crushing burden of a society that left her no other path. This, then, is the truth beneath the numbers. The trade was vast not because women were more sinful in the 19th century, but because survival demanded it. Now, as the fog coils tighter and the bells toll again in the distance, we prepare to move onward. From causes to consequences. From the desperation that drove women into the streets to the realities of their lives once they were there. Because the question that follows naturally is, who were these women, in flesh and blood? How young, how old, how many? The next step in our walk will take us into their very spectrum, into the lives of the children, the widows, the forgotten, all pressed into the same unyielding trade. And so, with the taste of coal smoke still sharp in the air, we turn toward them. The women themselves. The bells have struck the hour again, their sound rolling across the city like iron waves through fog. We've spoken of causes, the poverty, the wages, the betrayals that forced women into the streets. But now, as we press further, another truth looms before us. There was no single face of the Victorian prostitute. She was not one type, one age, one class. She was many. Imagine the street corner again, lamplight swaying, shadows stretching long. Look closely. The women gathered here are not uniform. Their faces carry the whole range of human time, the smooth cheeks of childhood, the lined mouths of age, everything in between. This is the cruelest truth. The streets claimed the very young and the very old alike. Let us begin with the youngest. She might be 12, sometimes younger. Barely tall enough to reach a man's shoulder, yet already standing on a corner, a ribbon tied clumsily in her hair to give the illusion of youth, though of course, youth is all she has. Many of these children were orphans, their parents dead of cholera, typhus, consumption. Others were simply abandoned, a burden too heavy for poor families to bear. The workhouse loomed as another fate, but for many, the streets seemed less cruel than those gray walls of discipline. Newspapers of the time reported with horror on the prevalence of child prostitution. Reformers raided brothels and found girls of 13, even 11. They were the cheapest, the most vulnerable, and often the most exploited. For some men, their youth was precisely the allure, a dark hypocrisy in a society that praised innocence by day and preyed upon it by night. Imagine her voice. High, uncertain, breaking as she calls out to passing men. Imagine the cold in her bones, the ache in her stomach. Imagine the shame she doesn't even fully understand yet. She doesn't dream of wealth or luxury, only of a bed, a piece of bread, a moment of safety. For thousands of children, this was not imagination. It was reality. And then, there were the young women. The majority of prostitutes in London were in their teens and early 20s. 16, 18, 20. The age when other girls of wealth were being dressed for balls, courted in drawing rooms, guided by mothers through the elaborate rituals of respectability. But here, on these streets, the same age meant something different. It meant standing in a shawl, waiting in the cold, hoping for a coin. Many of these young women had once been in service: housemaids, kitchen maids, scullery maids. Dismissed for trifles, seduced by masters, accused of impropriety, or simply worn down by endless work and no future. Once cast out, they often found themselves here. Others came from factories, their wages too small to live on. Some drifted in from the countryside, dreaming of London's promise, only to find themselves starving and alone. Look at them in the lamplight, cheeks rouged to hide the pallor of hunger, smiles painted over fatigue. To the men who sought them, they offered flirtation, laughter, the illusion of vitality. But behind the painted lips was exhaustion, fear, sometimes defiance. These women were not simply victims. Many were resilient, cunning, sharp. Survival demanded it. Move further down the spectrum, and you find women in their 30s, their 40s. Faces already weathered by hardship, yet still on the streets because there was nowhere else to go. Many were widows, their husbands lost to disease or the dangerous trades of docks, mines, factories. With children to feed, they turned to the streets as the last desperate resort. Picture a woman of 35. Once a wife, once a mother, now standing on a corner, her child perhaps asleep in a room upstairs, tended by another girl. She does not call out flirtatiously like the younger women. Her manner is brisk, businesslike. She has no illusions left, only necessity. Her clients are often the poorer sort, laborers, soldiers, men who pay little. She endures it because she must. Others in this group were women who had been in the trade for years. Some began young, and by 30 their bodies already bore the marks of hard living, disease, gin, violence. The city did not grant them long careers. By middle age, many were already discarded, pushed into worse poverty still. And then there were the oldest. Women in their 50s, even 60s, still on the streets, though their clients were few. Some worked as procurers, arranging meetings, running small brothels. Others continued themselves, though often reduced to the lowest, most desperate tiers: alleys, cellars, gin shops. They were figures of pity, sometimes even of horror to reformers, who saw in them the full arc of degradation. Yet think of the resilience. To have endured decades in such a life. To have outlasted disease, poverty, hunger, and still be standing in a doorway, still bargaining for a coin. Their voices cracked, their faces lined, but they survived. In a society that offered women few roles, they clung to this one, because it was the only one left. And so, when we speak of Victorian prostitution, we must imagine not one type of woman, but a vast spectrum. Children, teenagers, young women, mothers, widows, the aged. Each carrying her own story of survival, betrayal, resilience, and despair. Together, they formed the great multitude we spoke of earlier, the 50, 60, 70,000 women who walked these streets. But pause here, because this spectrum also reveals something darker. No woman was safe. Youth was not protection. Marriage was not protection. Age was not protection. At any stage, a woman might be pushed into this world, by poverty, by scandal, by abandonment. From cradle to grave, society's failures pressed upon her. Think of it, a 12-year-old girl and a 60-year-old widow, both walking the same street, both selling their bodies for survival. This was the reality of London. A city that proclaimed virtue, yet allowed, no, required, such contradictions. Now let your gaze travel across this street once more. The gaslight flickers on each face, each different age. The sound of boots on cobblestones grows louder, men approaching. The women shift, readying themselves. Some smile nervously. Some smirk knowingly. Some simply wait, resigned. This is the age spectrum of Victorian prostitution. Wide. Relentless. Tragic. Human. And as we linger here, one final truth becomes clear. Numbers and causes tell part of the story. But it is these faces, these ages, that make the reality undeniable. The trade was not only vast, it was all-encompassing, sweeping up the innocent and the aged alike. And so, with these faces in mind, we take our next step. Away from the lamplight, into the buildings that sheltered them. Into the brothels and houses of vice, where the spectrum of women found their nightly stage. The doors creak open, the smell of smoke and sweat drifts out, and our journey continues inside. The door closes behind us with a muffled thud, shutting out the damp fog of Whitechapel. Instantly, the air changes. It is warmer, thicker, and laced with smells that do not belong to the street. Lamp oil, sweat, stale perfume, the faint iron tang of blood from a nosebleed hastily wiped. Welcome to the inside of Victorian vice. This is not one place but many. Brothel could mean a dozen things in 1850s London, from grand townhouses where chandeliers flickered over velvet draperies, to cellars where straw mattresses lay damp with mold. Every class of man had his equivalent class of brothel. Just as London was a city of contrasts, so too was its underworld. The grand houses of the West End. Let's start with the most opulent. Picture a discreet house in Mayfair, its windows shuttered against the night, its entrance marked by nothing more than a polished brass knocker. Inside, however, is a world transformed. The foyer glows with gaslight. Carpets muffle your footsteps. A staircase sweeps upward, its banisters gleaming with polish. Here, the women descend like actresses taking the stage. They wear silks, corsets cinched tight, jewelry glittering in the lamplight. Their faces are powdered, their lips tinted red. They speak with practiced charm, laughter like crystal ringing across the drawing room. Clients arrive in carriages, top hats in hand, gloves tucked into breast pockets. Politicians, noblemen, wealthy merchants, men whose reputations in daylight rest on virtue, but whose nights are written here in whispers. These houses are not merely brothels. They are salons of sin. There is music, sometimes a piano tinkling in the corner, sometimes a hired violinist. There is wine and champagne, imported delicacies laid out on tables. The women here do not stand in the cold, they entertain, flirt, dance. A client may pay not only for an hour upstairs, but for the illusion of romance, of refinement. The madam presides over it all. She is both hostess and general, arranging meetings, managing her girls, ensuring discretion. Her power lies not in brute force but in reputation, her ability to guarantee both pleasure and silence. Without her, the edifice collapses. With her, men of Parliament can slip in unnoticed, their secrets kept safe within velvet-draped walls. The common brothels of the East. Now contrast this with the East End. Step through a door in Whitechapel or Shoreditch, and you'll find something else entirely. The stairs creak, the plaster peels, the smell of gin hits your nose before you reach the first landing. Rooms are small, crowded, their beds little more than wooden frames with straw mattresses. Sheets are unwashed, pillows flat with use. Here, there is no piano, no wine. Only gin, the universal solvent of shame. The women wait in cramped rooms, their dresses patched, their rouge smeared by sweat. They do not speak of romance or poetry. Their transactions are blunt, practical. A coin changes hands, a door shuts, footsteps creak overhead. Violence is closer here. A quarrel breaks out in the hallway. A man refuses to pay. A woman shouts back. A brawl spills down the stairs. The madam, if there is one, is less hostess than enforcer. She may be a former prostitute herself, hardened, scarred, wielding a cane or bottle to keep order. And yet these houses are full. Night after night, men crowd in, sailors from the docks, soldiers from the barracks, laborers with Saturday wages in their fists. They come not for velvet but for immediacy, for the release of hunger, anger, exhaustion. The lowest dens. But even this is not the bottom. Below the common brothels are the dens so low they barely count as houses at all. Cellars, garrets, abandoned stables, rented rooms by the night. Here, women work in filth, their clients often too drunk to stand, the transaction reduced to its most brutal form. Payment might be a few coppers, a meal, even a bed of straw for the night. Imagine a cellar in Ratcliffe Highway, near the docks. The air reeks of rot and sewage. A candle gutters in a broken bottle. On a mattress crawling with lice, a woman waits. Her dress is ragged, her body marked by sores. A sailor staggers in, drops a coin, collapses beside her. This is the lowest tier, where survival is pared to its rawest edge. Reformers who stumbled into such places wrote of them in tones of horror, describing dens of pestilence, where women and men alike seemed less human, more specters drifting through misery. The geography of vice. Brothels, like their clients, map themselves onto the city. In the West End, discreet houses near theaters and clubs. In the East End, crowded lodging houses doubling as brothels. Along the river, dockside dens serving sailors. Near barracks, houses catering to soldiers. The city's prostitution was not only vast, it was organized by geography, class, and need. Police knew where they were. Reformers knew where they were. Travelers could even buy guides, thinly veiled as directories of entertainment, listing addresses and reputations. London's brothels were simultaneously hidden and visible, denounced and tolerated. The atmosphere inside. Step back now into one of these houses, and listen. The sounds tell the story, laughter rising from the drawing room, footsteps creaking overhead, the pop of a cork, the harsh cough of a woman in the hallway. Music downstairs, sobbing upstairs. A mirror cracked, a dress torn, a clock ticking in the silence after the client leaves. Smell it too, lamp oil, stale sweat, tobacco smoke, spilled gin, perfume that tries but fails to disguise it all. The senses are overwhelmed, the air thick with contradictions. And beneath it all, the women wait. Some laugh loudly, their jokes sharp-edged with survival. Some sit silent, their eyes fixed on nothing. Some whisper promises, some glare with contempt. Each plays her role, each endures the bargain. Respectable visitors. It is tempting to think these houses belonged only to the poor. But remember, men of every class pass through their doors. Clerks, dock workers, soldiers, but also doctors, lawyers, parliamentarians. Reformers complain bitterly that the same men who thundered about morality by day disappeared into brothels by night. Hypocrisy was not incidental, it was structural. Imagine a member of Parliament slipping out of his carriage in Mayfair, his cloak drawn tight. He knocks, is admitted, disappears inside. Tomorrow, he will condemn the great social evil in a speech. Tonight, he lives it. The women's world. For the women themselves, these houses were both trap and refuge. Trap, because once inside, escape was rare. Many brothels function on debt, clothes, lodging, gin advanced by the madam, repayment demanded through work. A woman might find herself permanently bound, unable to earn enough to buy freedom. Refuge, because for some, a brothel meant protection. The streets were dangerous, exposure constant. In a house, there was at least a bed, a roof, a kind of order. Some women preferred it to the cold, the alleys, the constant threat of assault. But whether in velvet drawing rooms or stinking cellars, the reality remained the same. These houses were engines of survival, turning women's bodies into coin. The city at night. Step outside again. The street is alive, brothels glowing faintly through shuttered windows, laughter and song drifting out. Carriages clatter past, men slip in and out, women lean from windows to call down. The entire city, after dark, hums with this hidden world. And you realize, London's brothels were not side notes. They were integral to its rhythm. As much a part of the city as its theaters, its taverns, its churches. They stood at every level of society, from chandelier-lit parlors to rat-infested cellars. This was the geography of Victorian vice. And now, with the door creaking shut behind us once more, we step back into the foggy street. But not all prostitution happened indoors. Many women never saw the velvet of a West End brothel, or the moldy boards of an East End one. Their trade took place outside, in the alleys, the taverns, the very shadows of London. That is where we go next. The door groans open again, and the night air rushes in, cold, damp, smelling of coal smoke and sewage. You step outside and realize something. The brothels may have their velvet curtains, their chandeliers or their cracked plaster walls, but the majority of London's trade doesn't happen indoors at all. It happens here, in the open. Street prostitution was the true heartbeat of the city's underworld. Look around. Every alley mouth is a threshold, every gas lamp a stage light. The women stand in doorways, loiter beneath arches, lean against railings. They know the rhythms of the streets like sailors know tides, which corners bring the wealthier clients, which taverns disgorge dockworkers at closing, which alleys are dark enough to shield a hurried transaction. Walk down Whitechapel High Street at midnight, and you will see them gathered like shadows, their whispers mixing with the rattle of carriage wheels. Some call out boldly, laughter in their voices, selling not only their bodies but the illusion of joy. Others are quiet, waiting for eye contact, a hand signal, a gesture from a man passing by. And some, often the youngest, simply stand and stare, too new to know the trade's language, too desperate to leave. The taverns serve as their meeting grounds. Push open the door of a gin shop and the scene is the same on any given night, smoke thick as wool, men roaring with laughter, glasses clinking. At the back, in dimmer corners, women sit on laps, whisper in ears, strike bargains over mugs of gin. The air reeks of sweat and spilled alcohol, but for many, this is safer than the alleys. Drink loosens purses. A hand pressed to a thigh can mean a coin, and a coin can mean bread. Step back outside and listen. The sound of boots scuffing on wet stone. A sudden shriek from a nearby alley, followed by silence. Violence is never far away. Clients can be cruel, drunk, unpredictable. The police patrol, but unevenly, sometimes harassing the women themselves, sometimes turning a blind eye, sometimes pocketing bribes. For women who lived on these streets, every night was a gamble. Survival meant calculating risks. Which man seemed drunk but not violent? Which alley was dark enough to hide but not so dark it invited attack? The trade was not limited to the slums. Walk west toward Haymarket, Regent Street, or Covent Garden, and you'll find another kind of streetwalker. These women are better dressed, their shawls cleaner, their manners practiced. They stroll beneath the lamplight, pretending to be simply taking the night air. They approach men with soft words, not crude shouts. Their clients are wealthier, clerks, officers, gentlemen. But their desperation is no less. Respectability, even in tatters, could raise the price by a shilling or two. Further west still, around the theaters, you'll find the so-called night birds. They flutter through the crowds spilling out from opera houses and music halls, targeting men flushed with drink and entertainment. Here, seduction mingles with performance. A glance, a laugh, a whispered compliment, and then a quick bargain, a rendezvous down a side street. But for every woman who prowled Covent Garden, 100 more remained in the East End, where the trade was harsher. Here, it was not theatergoers but dock workers, soldiers, and laborers. Payment was often a few pence, sometimes no more than a meal or a drink. Many women went hungry even after selling themselves. Some slept in four-penny coffins, those grim lodging houses where for 4 pennies you could lean against a rope strung across a room and doze sitting upright, too poor even for a bed. Imagine that, to endure the street all night, only to rest your head on a rope come dawn. Street prostitution meant exposure not just to danger but to disease. The cobblestones were littered with more than refuse. Syphilis and gonorrhea spread like shadows through the city. Reformers whispered of entire regiments laid low by infection, of children born blind from mothers infected in back alleys. The risk was constant, yet unavoidable. Protection as we know it was rudimentary at best. Sheep gut condoms sold under the counter, expensive and unreliable. Most men refused them. Most women had no choice but to risk it. And yet, for all this brutality, the streets thrummed with a strange vitality. The women formed their own communities, their own codes of survival. They watched out for one another, warned of dangerous clients, shared coins or bread when they could. In the face of a city that condemned them, they carved out solidarity in whispers and glances. Think of this: London by day was empire, progress, industry. London by night was another empire altogether, one built on shadows, bargains, and desperate laughter echoing through alleys. And though polite society pretended otherwise, this nocturnal city touched every class. The dockworker stumbling from a tavern, the officer striding from the barracks, the gentleman slipping from his club, all left footprints on these stones. As the hour grows later, the gas lamps dim. Fog drifts low, curling around your ankles. The streets begin to thin. The women linger still, some heading back to garrets or lodging houses, others waiting for one last client before dawn. The city exhales, its pulse slowing. But the silence is deceptive. Because even as the night fades, consequences remain. Disease festers. Violence leaves scars. And beneath the surface, the demand never ceases. When darkness falls again tomorrow, the same streets will fill, the same bargains struck. And so, our walk cannot pause here. We've seen the streets and the brothels, the clients slipping in and out. But what of those clients themselves? Who are they truly? Men of every class, every rank. The very same men who, by daylight, claimed the mantle of morality. The hypocrisy grows sharper the closer you look. Come then, listen to the echo of boots once more. Tonight the focus shifts from the women in the shadows to the men who sought them, who kept the trade alive with coins and silence. Step with me into their world. The fog hasn't lifted. It clings low across the cobbles, pooling in alleys, glowing faintly in the gaslight. We've seen the women waiting in doorways and taverns, their lives bent under the weight of hunger and necessity. But if the streets were filled with their voices, their laughter, their bargains, then who answered them? Who filled their purses with coins? Who kept the great machinery of London's vice turning? It is easy to imagine a single type of man, coarse, brutish, drunk. But the truth is more complex, more unsettling. The clients of Victorian prostitutes came from everywhere. Every class, every age, every trade. They were the city itself, mirrored back in a darker light. Listen, footsteps echo in the fog. Heavy boots first, the kind worn by dock workers and laborers. These men come straight from the river, their hands cracked from hauling cargo, their backs bent with exhaustion. Their wages are in their pockets, earned by sweat and muscle, and before the money disappears into the landlord's hand or the grocer's bill, they slip into taverns, into alleyways, into the arms of women who wait. For them, the transaction is quick, blunt, almost wordless. A coin pressed into a palm, an hour of relief before dawn's labor calls again. Now lighter steps. Polished shoes, quicker strides. Clerks, apprentices, shop assistants, men in their 20s with wages too small to afford marriage, but too large to quiet their desire. They spend their days bent over ledgers, quills scratching, their nights wandering the gaslit streets where temptation waits. These men speak differently, more nervously perhaps, bargaining softly, trying to mimic the manners of their betters. But their coins are no less welcome. And then, listen again, different boots, sharper heels striking the stone. Officers from the barracks, soldiers on leave, sailors from ships moored along the Thames. Their laughter is loud, their pockets full of pay. They swarm in groups, rowdy, shouting, grabbing. The women know them well, sometimes generous, sometimes violent, always unpredictable. In some brothels, entire rooms are reserved for regiments, their visits timed with the rhythm of military paydays. But the spectrum widens further. Hear the softer footfalls now, the measured pace of a gentleman. His hat is tall, his coat well cut, his gloves of kid leather. He has dined well in the West End, perhaps attended the theatre, perhaps lingered too long over champagne. And now, carriage wheels wait at the curb while he disappears into a house whose windows are shuttered tight. For him, the prostitute is not only release but escape, from the rigid etiquette of polite society, from a marriage bound more by duty than affection. Tomorrow, he will attend church, shake hands in Parliament, perhaps speak gravely of morality. Tonight, he buys silence behind velvet curtains. There were professionals, too. Doctors, lawyers, journalists. Men whose reputations depended on respectability, yet who haunted the very streets they condemned in print. Charles Dickens himself wrote with pity and scorn about London's prostitutes, yet his private life strayed into whispers of scandal. The divide between condemnation and participation was razor thin. What united all these men, laborer or lord, clerk or colonel, was desire and access. A society that barred women from independence gave men unspoken permission. For the price of a coin, they could step outside the constraints of propriety, safe in the knowledge that shame clung only to the woman, never to them. The double standard was absolute. A man might visit brothels for years and still be considered respectable, even eligible for marriage. A woman who stepped onto the street once was ruined forever. Imagine the hypocrisy of it. Picture a parliamentarian delivering a fiery speech against the great social evil, his voice ringing through the chamber. He rails against fallen women, against vice corroding the empire. Then, hours later, he slips into a cab, rides to a discreet address in Mayfair, and spends the night in the arms of the very women he denounced. This was no rare contradiction. It was routine. The city itself made it easy. London's geography allowed anonymity. A man could leave his townhouse in Belgravia, walk a few streets, and vanish into the shadows of Pimlico or Soho. He could spend an hour in a brothel, then emerge again into gaslit respectability, his reputation unblemished. Women bore the scars, the shame, the disease. Men bore none. Listen to the exchanges. In a tavern, a dockworker growls his bargain, sliding a few coins across the table. In a West End house, a gentleman murmurs promises of gifts, of protection, his tone softer, more practiced. In the alleys, a soldier shouts, drunk, his arm clamped roughly around a girl's shoulders. Different men, different manners, yet all bound by the same act, turning women's desperation into their own brief escape. And what did they seek? Some sought only the physical, quick and crude. Others sought companionship, the illusion of intimacy. Some wanted laughter, others wanted silence. Still others demanded cruelty, power, humiliation, desires seldom spoken of in daylight but carried into these rooms at night. Brothels tailored themselves accordingly, offering not just bodies but performances, fantasies, roles. The scale of the trade reflected not only poverty among women but hunger among men, a hunger Victorian society pretended did not exist. The numbers tell their own story. Tens of thousands of clients every night. Multiply that by weeks, by months, by years, and you see it, prostitution was not fringe, not marginal. It was central to the rhythm of London's life. If 50,000 women worked the streets, then hundreds of thousands of men supported them. That means fathers, sons, brothers, husbands, all complicit, all silent. And so the city whispered around itself. Women condemned, men excused. Women marked forever, men untarnished. Newspapers scolded about fallen daughters, but seldom about the men who paid them. sermons thundered against female sin, not male hypocrisy. This imbalance was not hidden, it was shouted, enshrined, normalized. Picture the morning after. A clerk straightens his cravat, scrubs his hands, and steps into the office as if nothing happened. A dockworker shoulders his load at the quay, his night already forgotten. A gentleman sips tea in his townhouse, his wife across the table, her face pale in the morning light. She does not ask where he was. She cannot. Society itself has conspired to protect him. And beneath it all, the women return to their corners, their rooms, their brothels. They carry the disease, the bruises, the pregnancies, the shame. The men carry nothing but memory, if even that. The fog drifts heavier now, as if the city itself wishes to hide this imbalance, this great hypocrisy. But we cannot turn away. Because what the men carried with them, though invisible, was not harmless. They carried infection, syphilis spreading like fire through ranks of soldiers, through regiments, through entire families. They carried silence, ensuring the burden of sin fell only on women. They carried the weight of hypocrisy, building a society where vice was fed in secret and condemned in public. And so, as dawn begins to pale the edges of the sky, another truth emerges. The clients were not outsiders. They were not strangers. They were London itself, its workers, its officers, its leaders. Without them, the trade would not have existed. With them, it flourished. But this flourishing came at a price. Disease festered, spreading from brothels to barracks, from taverns to townhouses. Entire wards of hospitals filled with men rotting from syphilis, with women dying in childbirth from infections carried by their husbands. The very health of the empire itself began to shake under the weight of a secret never spoken aloud. And that is where we must go next. Away from the shadows of desire and into the harsher light of consequence. The diseases that ate at flesh and bone, the deaths that came in silence, the children born already marked. The dark cost of London's nightly bargains. The fog has not yet lifted. Dawn trembles on the horizon, pale and sickly, but the city's night does not vanish so easily. The men slip home, adjusting their collars, wiping the smell of gin from their breath. The women retreat to garrets, to shared rooms, to brothels where curtains still hang heavy with smoke. But the transactions of the night do not end when the coins change hands. They linger, unseen, festering in blood and bone. For London's great underworld of desire carried with it an equal empire of disease and death. Syphilis, gonorrhea, chancres, rashes, fevers, blindness, madness. These words were whispered in the same tones as curses, yet they were everywhere. Hospitals swelled with sufferers, surgeons cut away rotten flesh, children were born already infected. The city was a living organism, its bloodstream poisoned by infection carried quietly from alley to drawing room, from soldiers' barracks to nursery. Come, step with me into a hospital ward. The air is heavy with carbolic acid, the sharp bite of disinfectant barely masking the sweeter, more dreadful stench of rot. Rows of iron-framed beds stretch across the floor, each occupied by men whose bodies are crumbling under disease. Some lie silent, eyes glassy, sores blooming on their skin like dark flowers. Others writhe in fever, raving, restrained by straps. The doctors move briskly, their hands stained, their instruments crude. There are no antibiotics, no cures. Only mercury ointments that poison as much as they heal, only cauterization, only prayers. Listen to the cough of one man, the muttered prayers of another. That one was a soldier, his regiment decimated by syphilis caught in brothels near the docks. That one a clerk, his face hidden in shame as he dies slowly of a disease he cannot name aloud. They are victims as much as culprits, but society spares them shame. Their suffering is treated as unfortunate, unlucky, even natural. But the women, the women carry a heavier burden. For them, infection is not only sickness but condemnation. Imagine a girl of 17, her skin mottled, her body wasting. She is cast out of her brothel, too diseased to earn. She coughs blood in a lodging house until she collapses in the street. Reformers write of her in pamphlets as a cautionary tale, her face an emblem of fallen women. Yet no pamphlet names the men who infected her, who spread the rot in the first place. The diseases did not stop with the women either. They traveled further, quieter, more insidiously. A man visits a prostitute, contracts syphilis, and returns to his wife. She, dutiful, obedient, soon falls ill. Their unborn child is born blind, or dead, or crippled with infection before it ever takes a first breath. Entire families rotted from within, their ruin beginning in an alleyway or behind a brothel curtain. Doctors of the time wrote in hushed tones of the devastation. Whole wards of children born with congenital syphilis, their tiny faces twisted by lesions, their cries unceasing. Hospitals filled with wives bewildered by their own decline, never imagining the respectability of their husbands hid such secrets. But still, society looked only at the women on the streets, never at the men in the parlors. Step now into a graveyard. The ground is damp, the earth sodden with rain. Fresh mounds rise, marked by wooden crosses with no names. Here lie the women who died too soon, buried without ceremony, their names forgotten before the soil settles. Death came early for them, not just from disease, but from violence, from cold, from hunger. Yet disease was the most relentless companion, following them from their first coin to their last breath. And consider the irony. In a society obsessed with purity, chastity, and moral virtue, disease became the great equalizer. It ignored class, wealth, reputation. It crept into barracks, into palaces, into the homes of Parliament. The very men who thundered against vice often carried its mark upon their bodies. Their hypocrisy rotted them from within, even as they stood in church pews and raised their eyes to heaven. But still the women bore the greater stigma. When disease ravaged their bodies, they became outcasts. Brothels cast them off, clients avoided them, neighbors shunned them. They slipped lower and lower until there was nowhere left but the streets, coughing, wheezing, waiting for death. A man could wither in a hospital bed and still be pitied. A woman with the same sores was branded filth, her suffering proof of her immorality. Think of the sights of the city, brothels glowing faintly at night, taverns roaring with laughter, and in daylight, hospitals swelling with disease. Reformers toured the wards and recoiled. They wrote reports with numbers that staggered the eye, entire percentages of regiments disabled, thousands of women infected, children born already doomed. They called prostitution a plague upon the empire. And they were right, but not in the way they meant. The plague was not women. It was the system itself. Picture again the rhythm of the city. Night after night, coins change hands, bodies meet in shadow, men walk away untarnished, women left behind with infection coursing in their blood. Multiply it by weeks, by years, by decades, and you understand, London's great age of progress was shadowed by an epidemic of flesh, silent and corrosive, gnawing at the very foundations of its morality. And yet, out of this sickness, new questions arose. Should the government intervene? Should the police regulate the brothels, inspect the women, confine the diseased? Should society treat them as patients or as criminals? These debates swelled in the streets, in Parliament, in pulpits. For when death spreads unchecked, even hypocrisy begins to crack. The fog is thinning now, but the air remains heavy. Somewhere a church bell tolls, slow and mournful, calling the faithful to prayer. Yet its sound is swallowed by the coughs rising from hospital wards, by the whispers of men hiding their sores, by the cries of children born to suffer. The city is not only empire and elegance. It is a body infected, its blood carrying disease through every vein. And as we step from the graveyard, from the hospital, from the shuttered rooms where women waste away, another truth looms ahead. The government, faced with a plague it could not ignore, will soon step in. Its hand will be heavy, its measures brutal. Laws will be passed, women's bodies inspected, controlled, confined. Not for their sake, but for the men who use them. And so our walk carries us toward power. Toward Parliament, toward the Contagious Diseases Acts, toward the cold machinery of government intervention. The city never truly sleeps. Even as dawn brightens the edges of the sky, even as milk carts rattle through the streets, and church bells call the faithful, the echo of the night lingers. The alleys are quieter now, but the damage they harbor is not silenced. Disease festers in hidden places, in bloodstreams, in hospital wards where coughs echo like dirges. And when a sickness grows too vast to ignore, power inevitably stirs. The empire cannot look away forever. Parliament, ever eager to cloak itself in virtue, turns its gaze upon the streets, not in pity, not in justice, but in fear. By the middle of the 19th century, reports filled the desks of government ministers. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other venereal diseases were spreading unchecked through the city, and not only among the poor. Soldiers fell ill in alarming numbers. Regiments were crippled, barracks infected, entire units weakened. It was whispered that Britain's military strength itself was imperiled. And if the Empire's army faltered, what then of its global power? This was no longer a matter of morality. It was a matter of survival. So, in the cold chambers of Parliament, debates turned toward intervention. What could be done to control the great social evil? The conclusion, drawn with the blunt certainty of men who never question their own authority, was that women must be controlled. Not the men who paid them, not the officers who carried infection home to their wives, but the women whose bodies bore the stigma. The Contagious Diseases Acts were born. At first, they were framed narrowly, applied to garrison towns and naval ports, where soldiers and sailors were concentrated. The logic was simple, ruthless. If prostitutes were spreading disease among the troops, then prostitutes must be examined, registered, confined. The acts empowered police to arrest any woman suspected of being a prostitute and haul her before a medical officer. If found diseased, she could be locked in a hospital, sometimes for months, until deemed clean. Refusal to submit to examination meant imprisonment. Picture it, a woman walking down a street, perhaps a seamstress returning late from work, perhaps a widow buying bread. A policeman stops her, declares her a prostitute on suspicion alone. She is taken, examined invasively, confined against her will. No trial, no appeal. Her body is the battleground, her freedom the price of military health. The examinations themselves were brutal, demeaning. Instruments cold, hands rough, privacy non-existent. Reformers who later exposed the details described them as little more than state-sanctioned assault. Women wept, screamed, resisted. But the law was on the side of the examiners, not the examined. The state, in its hunger to protect soldiers and sailors, reduced thousands of women to objects, diseased or clean, fit or unfit, nothing more. And yet the men? They remained untouched. A soldier could infect a dozen women and walk free. A gentleman could spread disease from brothel to brothel without consequence. The law placed the entire burden on women, as though vice itself were born in their bodies, not in the transactions men demanded nightly. This hypocrisy sparked outrage. At first, the acts passed quietly, tucked into the machinery of empire, their scope limited. But as they spread, extended to more towns, applied with greater force, so too did resistance. Women reformers, led by the formidable Josephine Butler, rose in protest. They called the acts a disgrace, a violation of liberty, an insult to womanhood itself. They argued that the state had no right to treat half its citizens as mere vessels for disease control. They marched, petitioned, published pamphlets that laid bare the cruelty of the examinations. But think of the courage it took. Victorian women were expected to be silent, modest, obedient. To speak openly of prostitution, venereal disease, sexual coercion, this was scandalous in itself. Yet Butler and her allies did not falter. They described the acts as surgical rape, shaming the government with words sharper than scalpels. They carried their protest into the very halls of Parliament, demanding repeal. Meanwhile, on the streets, the women continued to bear the brunt. Arrests, examinations, confinement. Some welcomed the hospitals as a respite from hunger, from cold, from the endless scramble for survival. Others feared them, fled from police, hid in alleyways. The acts did not end prostitution. They did not end disease. They merely shifted the suffering, deepened the stigma, carved injustice into law. Consider the image: a young woman held down for inspection, her dignity stripped away in the name of national strength. Outside, the city bustles with men whose footsteps ring freely on the cobbles, untouched by the law's hand. This was Victorian morality laid bare, not the eradication of vice, but its regulation, its domestication, its control through women's bodies alone. And all the while, disease persisted. Soldiers still fell ill, wives still suffered, children were still born blind. The state's intervention, for all its brutality, was little more than a bandage on a wound that ran to the bone. But the acts left another scar, one less visible but equally lasting. They revealed the naked double standard of the age. They showed that when morality and power collided, morality would always yield. The state did not seek to abolish prostitution. It sought to manage it, to harness it for the empire's needs. Respectability was sacrificed to expedience, virtue to military strength. And in this hypocrisy lay fuel for a wider reckoning. Butler's campaign gathered momentum, drawing in not only reformers but ordinary citizens horrified by the idea of legalized violation. After decades of struggle, the acts were repealed in the 1880s, their shadow lingering long after. But in our night's walk, standing here in the fog, their impact is immediate. Imagine the fear in women's eyes as they pass policemen on corners, never knowing if suspicion alone might strip away their freedom. Imagine the silent anger of wives who nursed husbands through disease they themselves never sought. Imagine the frustration of reformers whose voices rang against deaf walls of Parliament. The city is thick with contradiction, an empire that preached virtue yet legalized assault, a government that claimed to protect health yet destroyed lives. And beneath it all, the same old silence, men walking free, women carrying the burden. The echoes of those acts still hang in the air as we leave Parliament's shadow. Our steps lead back into the streets, but our eyes are sharper now. We have seen the machinery of power grind down the powerless. And as the fog folds around us again, another truth rises to meet us. The double standards were not confined to law alone. They permeated every corner of Victorian life. Men excused, women condemned. Men forgiven, women ruined. It is time, then, to walk into that double world, to see the scale of hypocrisy not just in Parliament's halls but in the very fabric of society. The fog swirls thick again as though the city itself wishes to cloak what we've just witnessed. Parliament's laws, the inspectors' hands, the cries of women forced to submit, all of it feels heavy in the air. Yet if you pause, if you listen closely, you realize something. The contagious diseases acts were not an aberration. They were a symptom of a far deeper sickness that ran through every vein of Victorian society. It was not only in the hospitals and barracks that injustice reigned, but in parlors, in pulpits, in drawing rooms, in every whispered judgment of who could be forgiven and who must be damned. This was the age of the double standard. Imagine the city by daylight now, fog thinning in the pale sun. Men stride to work in their frock coats, newspapers tucked under their arms, their faces stern with respectability. Women moved more carefully, gloves buttoned, skirts lifted from the mud, their eyes lowered. On the surface, it looks like order, like virtue itself embodied in routine. But beneath it, contradictions seethe. For in this world, men were permitted hungers that women were punished for. A man who sought prostitutes was excused. Boys will be boys, men will be men. His indiscretion was a private matter, shrugged off, sometimes even joked about among friends. But a woman who sold herself, even once, was ruined forever. She lost her reputation, her employability, her very place in society. He walked free, she was branded for life. Think of a husband straying to brothels while his wife tended the home. His absence explained away by business. His infection explained as illness. But if his wife, driven by loneliness or poverty, so much as entertained another man, she would be cast out, cut off, left to starve. Fidelity was demanded of women, indulgence permitted to men. The hypocrisy ran deeper still. Women were raised to be pure, chaste, virtuous, and yet men were expected to sow wild oats before marriage. Who, then, were they to sow them with? The contradiction was almost grotesque in its simplicity. Society demanded that some women fall so that others could remain pure. The prostitute existed so that the wife might be preserved, as though vice were the scaffolding that held up virtue. Picture this: a drawing room in Belgravia, curtains drawn against the fog, a mother instructing her daughters on propriety. They must guard their reputations, avoid the slightest hint of scandal, never be alone with a man unsupervised. Across town, her husband dines late, then slips into Soho for an hour of pleasure. When he returns, his daughters are untouched by scandal, his wife's virtue unblemished. The sacrifice has already been made by another woman in the shadows. The family's respectability rests on her ruin. The double standard bled into literature, sermons, law. Preachers thundered against fallen women, warning that they dragged men into sin. Rarely did they thunder against the men themselves. Novelists painted prostitutes as tragic figures, ruined, pitiful, deserving of pity perhaps, but never redemption. And if redemption was written, it was almost always through death. A fallen woman could be mourned, forgiven in her coffin, but not restored in life. Consider Dickens, that great chronicler of Victorian London. He gave us Nancy in Oliver Twist, the prostitute with a heart of gold who sacrifices herself to protect the innocent. She is brave, selfless, noble even, but she must die. Society could pity her, but never allow her to live on, reformed, accepted. Her death purges her sin, makes her palatable to readers who wept over her fate, yet never questioned the double standard that demanded her sacrifice. In contrast, male characters, lecherous, corrupt, even criminal, often lived, repented, were forgiven. The message was clear: men might stray and return. Women could not. Step with me into a courtroom now. A man is accused of assaulting a woman. His lawyer sneers at her character, calls her immoral, untrustworthy, perhaps even a prostitute. The jury nods. The case collapses. For in Victorian courts, a woman's past defined her present. A man could harm her, infect her, destroy her, yet her reputation was the thing placed on trial. The law, like society, leaned always to his side. This was not hidden. It was not subtle. It was the foundation upon which morality itself was built. The Victorians spoke endlessly of female virtue, female modesty, female chastity, but always in contrast to male freedom. A man's appetite was natural. A woman's appetite was sinful. A man's infidelity was forgivable. A woman's was catastrophic. The balance was not balance at all, but a seesaw weighted entirely against her. And still, women endured it. Wives bore the shame of diseases they never sought. Daughters grew up warned not of men's behavior, but of their own supposed weakness. Prostitutes carried the weight of society's vice, branded, discarded, condemned. And men? They remained the arbiters, the lawmakers, the moral judges, even as they fed nightly on the very sin they denounced. Walk again into the streets at dusk. The lamps are being lit, the city stirring into its second life. Women step out into the cold, their shawls pulled tight, their eyes scanning the shadows. Across the road, men gather in taverns, laughing, drinking, coins clinking on wood. Soon, some will cross the street. They will strike bargains in whispers, vanish into alleys, emerge buttoning their coats. Tomorrow, they will go about their lives untouched. Tomorrow, the women will be condemned anew. The fog folds around us, thick and heavy, as though the city itself feels the weight of this hypocrisy. But the story does not end here. Because amid the condemnations and double standards, another voice was rising, voices of reformers, of charities, of missions that sought to offer women a way out. Fragile, imperfect, often tinged with their own moralizing, but still a glimmer in the shadows. Our steps turn toward them now, toward the missions in back streets, the shelters for fallen women, the charities that promise bread, work, perhaps even redemption. A world where pity mingled with control, where reform was offered but always under the strict gaze of morality. The night deepens. The gas lamps flicker. And we walk toward these fragile refuges, toward the stories of charity and reform that sought to save what society itself had condemned. The fog folds tighter around us as though the city itself is weary of its own hypocrisy. The double standard hangs heavy, and yet, amid the shadows, flickers of another world appear, small lamps burning in back streets, doors marked not with velvet curtains or the lure of gin, but with crosses, with scripture, with the promise of bread. For while society condemned, while Parliament controlled, there were also those who sought to save. Charity and reform, fragile, imperfect, sometimes suffocating, but still, for many women, the only chance of escape. Step softly with me now into one of these missions. The door creaks open and the smell changes. Not of tobacco and sweat, nor of spilled gin, but of coal fires and boiled broth. The air is heavy with starch, laundry soap, and the faint tang of disinfectant. Inside, a dozen women sit bent over sewing, their fingers pricked raw, their eyes downcast. A matron paces among them, Bible in hand, her voice sharp yet not unkind. This is a refuge, a shelter for fallen women. The name itself carries a sting. Fallen. It implies they once stood, pure and upright, and now lie ruined on the ground. But here, reformers insist, they may rise again. If they repent, if they submit, if they trade the streets for scripture and needlework, they might claw their way back toward respectability, though never quite to equality. Missions like these spread across London in the 19th century. Some were run by churches, others by private charities, others still by determined individuals, often women themselves, who believed no soul was beyond saving. They offered food, shelter, sometimes even training in trades like laundry or sewing. For many women, half-starved and exhausted, these missions were a lifeline. Better a roof and a bed than another night in the cold. But the price was high. Rules were strict: early rising, prayers morning and night, endless labor, silence except when permitted. A woman's body, once bought by men in shadows, was now claimed by reformers in daylight. She was told when to eat, when to work, when to sleep, how to repent. Her very steps were measured by others. Escape from vice came at the cost of freedom. Some missions brimmed with genuine compassion. Reformers wrote with deep pity, seeing prostitutes not as sinners but as victims, of poverty, of men, of society itself. They wept over the girls of 13 sold into brothels, over the widows forced to sell themselves to feed children. They fought to offer alternatives, to remind the world that these women were still human, still deserving of care. But others dripped with moral judgment. They spoke of cleansing, of purging sin, of washing women clean in both soap and scripture. They called them Magdalens, like Mary Magdalene, the repentant prostitute of the Bible, forever defined by their past, forever in need of penance. For every hand extended in kindness, there was another clutching a Bible, ready to remind them of their fall. Consider the story of Josephine Butler, that fiery reformer who campaigned not only against the contagious diseases acts but also for the rescue of women from prostitution. She walked the streets herself, sought out the women in alleys, invited them into her home. She spoke not only of their sin but of their suffering, daring to address Parliament in words unflinching, daring to force men to hear what they preferred to ignore. To many Victorians, she was scandalous, speaking openly of sex, of venereal disease, of the unspeakable. But to countless women, she was a beacon. And yet even Butler could not escape the framework of her age. Her compassion was fierce, but her language still spoke of rescue, of salvation, of lifting women from vice rather than questioning why vice was society's scaffolding in the first place. There were other refuges too. The Magdalene asylums, for example, where women might live under discipline, often for years, sewing and praying, their labor funding the very institutions that claimed to save them. Some left these places to new lives in service, even in marriage. Others felt imprisoned, their freedom exchanged for another kind of captivity. Many disappeared back to the streets, unable to bear the strictures, unable to survive outside. But not all reform was bound to Scripture. Secular charities opened as well, lodging houses for destitute women, soup kitchens, workrooms where they might earn wages without selling themselves. These, too, were lifelines, though fragile ones. They could not absorb the tens of thousands in need. They patched holes in a sinking ship, but the water kept pouring in. Still, for some, charity meant survival. Imagine a woman who has spent a decade on the streets, her health failing, her beauty gone. She stumbles into a mission one winter night, too weak to walk further. She is given soup, a bed, clean clothes. The matron sits by her, reads softly from Scripture. For the first time in years, she sleeps without fear. Perhaps she leaves again, perhaps she stays, perhaps she dies beneath that roof. But in that moment, she knows a gentleness the streets never offered. The reformers themselves lived contradictions. They sought to save, but often controlled. They pitied, but also judged. They raised funds from wealthy donors who condemned prostitutes in public while using them in private. Charity was tangled in hypocrisy as much as vice. And yet, in these small refuges, amid the prayers and the sewing, a shift was happening. For the first time, society began to see prostitutes not merely as sinners but as humans, as women crushed beneath an unjust system. Reform cracked the facade of hypocrisy, even if only slightly. It laid the groundwork for later movements, campaigns for repeal, for women's rights, for suffrage. The voices that rose in missions and shelters would not be silenced forever. Step back into the street. The fog curls around us still, but faintly, a hint of dawn gleams above. Behind the shuttered windows of missions, women pray. Behind the doors of brothels, women laugh and cry. In Parliament, men argue over laws. And in the alleys, others still wait in silence, hungry, cold. Charity and reform flicker like lanterns in this fog, small, fragile lights in an endless night. And yet even here, contradictions multiply. For every mission saving one woman, 100 more slip into the streets. For every reformer weeping in pity, another gentleman leaves a brothel in secret. For every prayer whispered in a shelter, another coin clinks into a palm outside. The story is not one of redemption alone. It is one of tension, of fragile hope against overwhelming despair. And as we follow the fog further, another current draws us onward. The way literature itself seized upon these women, how novels and plays turned them into symbols, how culture both revealed and obscured their lives. The city waits, its bookshops lit, its theaters open, its stories whispering of prostitutes not as flesh and blood but as characters, tropes, cautionary tales. And that is where our steps carry us next, into the pages of Victorian literature, where the voices of these women were reshaped, rewritten, and remembered, or erased. The fog of London is not only made of smoke and soot, not only of damp and coal and the reek of the river. It is made of stories. Stories whispered in alleys, sung in taverns, preached from pulpits, and written into books. For while thousands of women lived and died in the shadows of the city, their presence seeped into the imagination of the age. They became symbols, characters, cautionary tales. Literature, that proud mirror of Victorian virtue, could not help but reflect the world's darkest contradictions. Step now with me into a bookshop in the Strand. The windows glow with gaslight, the shelves heavy with new novels, penny dreadfuls, serials fresh from the presses. Readers crowd around, hungry for stories to carry them away from the grit of the streets. And yet, woven into these pages, again and again, appear figures who look suspiciously familiar, the women we have just walked among, transfigured into fiction. Charles Dickens gave us Nancy and Oliver Twist. Step closer, lean into her shadow. Nancy is fierce, compassionate, battered by the streets yet still capable of loyalty, of love. She protects Oliver, defies Bill Sikes, and in the end, pays with her life. Her death is brutal, her redemption sealed only in blood. Readers wept for her, pitied her, even loved her, but note carefully, Dickens could not let her live. To allow a prostitute to walk away into a new life, reformed, accepted, would break the unspoken contract of the age. She must die, so that her suffering could become a moral lesson rather than a social challenge. Elizabeth Gaskell, in Mary Barton and Ruth, approached the subject with a gentler hand. In Ruth, the fallen woman is not a hardened prostitute, but a seamstress seduced and abandoned, left to struggle with illegitimacy and social condemnation. Gaskell's sympathy is tender, her critique sharp. Yet even she cannot fully redeem Ruth without sacrifice. Ruth dies in the end, sanctified by suffering, her virtue restored only through death. Again, the pattern, pity is permitted, survival is not. Poets, too, wove their verses with the figure of the fallen woman. Dante Gabriel Rossetti's sonnets, Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market, even Tennyson's laments. They circle again and again around women ruined, lost, broken, their bodies metaphors for social decay. In Christina Rossetti's case, the sympathy is palpable. Her own volunteer work with fallen women colored her verse. But still, the fallen woman remained a trope, a symbol more than a person. And what of the penny dreadfuls, the serialized tales that filled parlors and boarding houses alike? These reveled in lurid detail. Brothels described in tones of horror and fascination, villains luring girls into ruin, heroines trembling at the brink of dishonor. The readership devoured them, both shocked and titillated. It was a paradox. Respectable Victorians decried vice, yet consumed stories of it eagerly, safe in the knowledge that fiction allowed them to peer into shadows without being tainted. Theaters, too, played their part. Melodramas strutted across the stage, their heroines pure, their villains vile, their fallen women tragic. Audiences wept, applauded, and returned home to speak solemnly of morality. All the while, real women stood outside the very theaters, waiting in the fog for customers leaving the show. Fiction and flesh, performance and reality, met on the same cobblestones. Even reform literature used these depictions. Pamphlets and tracts told stories of ruined girls, of virtuous daughters seduced by smooth-tongued villains. These tales were meant to shock, to warn, to stir pity and funds for missions. They were circulated widely, each one a blend of fact and fiction, exaggeration and reality. The prostitute became a figure not only of sin but of narrative utility, her suffering a tool in the hands of reformers, novelists, preachers alike. But what was lost in all this? The women's own voices. Few prostitutes left writings of their own. Their lives were narrated by others, their images drawn by men and women who observed, judged, pitied, or condemned, but rarely listened. Literature painted them as archetypes, tragic, fallen, doomed, rarely as complex individuals who laughed, joked, schemed, survived. The city silenced them, and the page enshrined that silence. Imagine again Nancy, lying dead in Dickens's novel, her sacrifice complete. Readers weep, critics praise the moral lesson, society congratulates itself on its sensitivity. Meanwhile, in the real Whitechapel, another Nancy stumbles into an alley, beaten by a client, coughing blood from disease. No novel records her. No audience weeps for her. Her story vanishes into fog. And yet, these depictions mattered. They shaped public consciousness. They turned prostitutes into figures of fascination, pity, horror. They influenced how reformers campaigned, how laws were debated, how ordinary readers understood the world around them. Literature, for all its distortions, was part of the same ecosystem of hypocrisy and desire. So as you hold that book in the Strand shop, or sit in a theater seat in Covent Garden, remember, you are not only consuming entertainment. You are participating in the construction of morality itself, in the shaping of society's view of the women who stand outside in the fog. Their lives become tropes, their suffering narrative fuel. And once again, the double standard is clear. Male vice is a detail, female vice is a story, a tragedy, a symbol. The fog curls tighter as we leave the shop, the theater, the pamphlet stand. The gas lamps flicker, the streets damp beneath our boots. Literature has given us its version of the fallen woman, but the city has its own story still to tell. Scandals whispered in gentlemen's clubs, secrets buried in Parliament, rumors of aristocrats caught in brothels. For behind the fiction lies reality, and reality is often far more damning. Come with me, then, as we step into those whispered corridors. The scandals and secrets of Victorian London wait for us, their voices hushed but insistent, their echoes resounding from the heights of power to the depths of the alleys. The theater doors close behind us, and once more the damp night presses in. The gas lamps hiss, the cobblestones glisten, and the stories linger in your ears. The novels, the sermons, the poems that painted prostitutes as symbols of ruin. But now, step closer, for there is another layer to London's story. One less often told in print, one whispered in clubs and drawing rooms, muttered in corridors of power, splashed in scandal sheets and hushed in courtrooms. For while fiction turned prostitutes into tragic archetypes, reality wrote its own tales, scandals and secrets that reached into the very heart of Victorian society. The fog guides us westward, toward Pall Mall, toward the gentlemen's clubs where port is poured and politics debated. These polished halls are built upon reputation, on the unspoken assumption that members are paragons of respectability. Yet behind closed doors, many of the same men who thundered against vice indulged in it nightly. Some even found themselves unmasked, their secrets spilling into the press. Imagine a member of Parliament, his speeches brimming with moral outrage, discovered frequenting a brothel in Soho. The newspaper seize upon the story, the scandal ripples outward. Yet note the pattern, often it is the brothel keeper who is ruined, the women whose names are dragged through the mud. The man himself, though disgraced, may return in time to public life. Reputation for him is a wound that heals. For her, it is a grave. Consider, too, the aristocracy. Stories circulated of dukes and lords maintaining kept women, installing them in comfortable lodgings, paying for their clothes, their servants, their silence. Some women rose from the streets into this strange half-life, lifted into luxury but never into respectability. They were both envied and scorned, their beauty a commodity, their security always dependent on a man's whim. The moment he tired of her, she fell back into the fog, her silks traded for rags. And then there were the scandals that shook the city. The case of the notorious brothel keeper, Mother B., whose house in the West End was said to entertain not only wealthy merchants, but peers of the realm. When the place was raided, names whispered through drawing rooms like sparks through tinder. The police files bulged with details too damning to print. Respectable society tooted, gasped, then quickly covered its tracks. Silence was the balm of the powerful. One cannot walk these streets without brushing against rumor. Step into a tavern near Covent Garden, and you'll hear whispers of an actor caught in bed with a prostitute, and a peer of the realm, the triangle too delicious for gossip to resist. Step into a barber's shop, and the talk is of a judge's son found dead of an overdose in a brothel. Step into a maid's quarters, and you'll hear servants repeating what they've overheard, the lord of the house slipping out at night, the carriage waiting discreetly at a side entrance. Scandal was currency, traded in glances and whispers, sometimes printed in scandal sheets sold cheaply on the streets. These papers thrived on half-truths and insinuations, never daring to name outright, but always hinting enough for readers to connect the dots. Londoners devoured them eagerly, both condemning and delighting in the spectacle. Respectability was a fragile mask, and everyone knew it. Even the monarchy was not untouched. Though Queen Victoria herself embodied domestic virtue, her sons and courtiers did not always follow suit. Rumors clung to the royal household, stories of affairs, of indiscretions carefully buried by loyal journalists and discreet policemen. The empire could not afford the tarnish of scandal at its pinnacle, yet the whispers persisted in drawing rooms, lending the royals an aura of both awe and suspicion. But beyond gossip, there was danger. For scandal could ruin more than reputations. It could topple careers, break families, shatter illusions. A young officer caught in a brothel might see his commission ruined. A merchant exposed in scandal might watch his business collapse. A woman named in such stories might lose everything: work, home, family, her life reduced to ashes by a rumor. Secrets were survival, exposure was destruction. And yet, even in secrecy, hypocrisy reigned. The same men who feared scandal the most were often the most reckless, confident their wealth and power would shield them. Often it did. Policemen turned blind eyes, judges leaned toward leniency, newspapers hesitated to name the great. Scandal was a storm that swept hardest against the weak, leaving the powerful damp but still standing. Picture again the city at night. In Belgravia, curtains drawn against the fog, a lord dines with his family while his mistress waits in a hidden lodging a mile away. In Soho, shutters rattle as the police raid a brothel, dragging women into the street, while their clients slip quietly out the back. In the Strand, scandal sheets are hawked by boys calling out lurid headlines, "Gentlemen's shame!" while readers snatch them up, pretending disapproval even as their eyes devour every word. London lived on secrets. It thrived on them, fed on them, even as it denied them. Respectability was its proudest boast, hypocrisy its most enduring habit. And in that contradiction, scandal found its soil. But scandals fade. Secrets, too, eventually dissolve into silence. What remains is change. By the later decades of the century, the city itself began to shift. Reforms deepened, laws altered, public attitudes stirred uneasily. The world of prostitution, once so vast and visible, began to contract, to recede, though never fully disappear. The story we have walked through, the brothels, the alleys, the diseases, the scandals, was reaching its turning point. The fog thickens once more, but ahead we see the glow of a new century beginning to stir. London will not remain unchanged. The decline of the hidden world is coming. And it is into that twilight of vice and reform that we must now step. The fog clings still, but it is thinner now, as though the city itself is exhaling after decades of secrets. We have walked through alleys and parlors, through brothels and barracks, through the whispered scandals of gentlemen and the silences of women. Yet nothing in London stands still. Just as the river shifts with every tide, so too did the hidden world of prostitution begin to change. Slowly, unevenly, almost reluctantly, it declined. Not vanished, never vanished, but altered, pressed into new shapes by reform, by law, by shifting morality, by the inexorable march of time. Imagine London in the 1880s. The empire is at its height. Railways knit the nation together, telegraphs hum with invisible messages, industry roars louder than ever before. And yet, in this same city, the streets are different than they were 30 years earlier. The old rookeries, those festering labyrinths of alleyways and cellars, are being torn down in the name of progress. Model dwellings rise where slums once sprawled. Wide boulevards cut through old districts, opening once dark corners to gaslight and police patrols. The geography of vice shifts with the bricks. Some brothels close, Others move deeper into the city's hidden crevices, scattered further apart. Public opinion, too, is shifting. The repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts in 1886 marks not just a victory for reformers like Josephine Butler, but a change in how society thinks about women. Prostitution is still condemned, still stigmatized, but it is increasingly seen as a symptom of poverty, not merely sin. Reformers speak not only of saving souls but of improving wages, of offering alternatives. The language is still moral, still tinged with judgment, but the edges have softened. And then there is fear. The specter of disease still looms, but another kind of fear emerges in the 1880s, the fear of violence. The East End, already infamous for poverty, becomes the stage for horrors that grip the world: the murders of Jack the Ripper. His victims are prostitutes, women of the streets, and their deaths tear through London's conscience like a knife. Newspapers feast on the gore, yet also, for perhaps the first time, dwell on the lives of the women themselves, their hunger, their homelessness, their struggle to survive. For a moment, the city looks at them not only as vice but as victims. The murders horrify, titillate, sensationalize, but also mark a turning point. Prostitution is no longer just a hidden undercurrent. It is thrust into the center of public consciousness. Yet decline is not only a matter of opinion or geography. It is also economic. By the late century, opportunities for women, though still limited, expand ever so slightly. Factories, shops, schools, offices, new spaces begin to open, new jobs carved out of the industrial boom. Wages remain low, conditions harsh, but alternatives exist where before there were none. Some women who might once have fallen into prostitution now bend over typewriters instead of alley walls, or stand behind counters instead of tavern doors. It is not salvation, but it is a shift. The very pace of life changes. The growth of suburbs pulls families away from the city's center. Respectability spreads like iron rails, carrying middle-class ideals into every corner. Where once the mingling of classes and narrow streets blurred boundaries, now distance separates them. Prostitution does not vanish, but it loses its omnipresence. It becomes less visible, less central to the rhythm of daily life. Police pressure intensifies too. Brothels that once thrived openly now shudder under raids. Streetwalkers are driven from central thoroughfares into darker alleys, further from polite society's gaze. Respectability demands its streets back. The city, ever eager to cleanse its face, pushes vice further underground. But let us not mistake decline for disappearance. Even as brothels closed, even as reformers triumphed, even as suburbs spread, women still waited in shadows, still bargained for survival. The numbers diminished, but the trade endured, as old as hunger itself. What changed was not the existence of prostitution but its shape, its visibility, its role in society's story. Pause here, and imagine walking through Soho in 1890. The music halls blare with song, the streets alive with revelers, but the old open trade has thinned. Women linger still, but fewer, more cautious. Some houses remain, but quieter, their windows darkened, their entrances discreet. The grand scandalous dens of the mid-century are relics, their infamy remembered more than repeated. Vice has not died, but it has been pushed back, its edges trimmed by law, reform, fear, and change. Yet even in decline, contradiction persists. Newspapers still thunder about fallen women. Politicians still decry vice while indulging it. Gentlemen still slip into discreet lodgings. The hypocrisy remains, though the stage grows smaller. And in this twilight, the women themselves remain trapped, fewer in number, perhaps, but still carrying the same burdens, still condemned, still silenced. Think of the irony. As prostitution's visibility shrinks, so too does the pity once extended. In the earlier decades, reformers wept over fallen women. Novelists penned tragic heroines, pamphlets pleaded for funds. By the century's end, the fallen woman is less central to society's imagination. She fades not only from the streets but from the cultural stage. Out of sight, out of mind. The silence that swallows her is another kind of death. And yet, if you listen closely, her footsteps still echo in the fog. In Whitechapel, in Soho, in lodging houses and quiet garrets, women still trade themselves for survival. The decline is not an ending but a transformation. The hidden world shifts shape, preparing to follow London into the new century, carrying its contradictions into modernity. So here we stand, near the threshold of the 20th century. Behind us, decades of vice, hypocrisy, disease, reform, scandal. Ahead, a world still haunted by what came before. The decline of the hidden world is not triumph, not tragedy, but transition. And as the gas lamps flicker one last time before electric light begins to glow across the city, we prepare to take our final step. For the story does not end in the fog of the 19th century. It lingers, its contradictions seeping into the bones of society long after the brothels are shuttered. The shadow of Victorian morality stretches forward, shaping the world we inherit. And it is into that shadow that we now walk to close our journey. The lamps burn low, their glow wavering in the mist as if the city itself is preparing to slip into sleep. We have walked a long road together, through alleys and brothels, through Parliament's chambers and mission halls, through novels and scandal sheets, through whispers and cries. Now, as we near the edge of the century, it is time to pause, not in silence, but in reflection. For the world we have wandered has not vanished. It lingers still, its contradictions woven deep into the fabric of the age that followed. The Victorians prided themselves on their morality. They spoke of virtue, of purity, of duty, of empire girded by righteousness. They built statues and monuments, wrote sermons and novels, thundered from pulpits and parliament alike that theirs was an age of moral clarity. And yet, we have seen the truth beneath the surface. That morality was built on contradiction. It demanded female purity while excusing male appetite. It condemned women for falling while offering them no way to stand. It punished them for disease while sparing the men who spread it. It thundered against vice while consuming it nightly. The shadow of Victorian morality is not virtue, but hypocrisy. And yet, hypocrisy is never without consequence. The women we have walked beside bore those consequences in their flesh and in their silence. They carried the infections, the bruises, the hunger. They endured the raids, the examinations, the sermons, the novels that used their lives as lessons. They carried shame that was never theirs to begin with. For every man who slipped out of a brothel unmarked, a woman was left behind marked forever. For every gentleman who indulged in secrecy, a woman's name was ruined in public. For every politician who spoke of the great social evil, women were the ones dragged into hospitals stripped of freedom. But even beyond the personal, the shadow extended further. It shaped institutions, culture, memory. The very way we talk about morality today still bears traces of it, the language of fallen women, the separation of purity and sin, the insistence that women must be guardians of virtue while men are permitted indulgence. The double standards of the 19th century echo still, softened, reshaped, but not erased. Imagine again the city in its twilight. The fog drifting low over the Thames, the hum of industry settling into evening. The brothels shutter one by one, the missions grow quieter, the newspapers turn to other scandals. The women slip further into silence. But the legacy remains, heavy as coal smoke. The contradictions of Victorian London did not end with the century. They seeped forward, into law, into literature, into the very way we think about gender, morality, and desire. Even now, when we speak of vice and virtue, we echo Victorian tones. Even now, when scandal erupts around powerful men, the women involved often bear harsher scrutiny. Even now, the division between public virtue and private appetite remains. The Victorians may be long gone, but their shadow is not. It stretches across the decades, across the centuries, shaping us still. And yet, within that shadow, there are also sparks of light. The campaigns of reformers like Josephine Butler planted seeds of women's rights. The exposure of hypocrisy forced cracks in the facade. The gradual decline of open prostitution in the late century did not end suffering, but it did force society to confront, however imperfectly, the realities of poverty, of gender inequality, of the need for compassion. Out of the contradictions came the first fragile steps toward change. So, as we stand here at the end of our walk, let us look back one last time. Picture the women we have seen, standing in the fog at midnight, laughter sharp with hunger, sitting in brothels beneath chandeliers, smiling with practiced grace, bent over sewing in missions, their fingers raw, lying in hospital wards, coughing blood. Picture the men, too, striding from clubs into shadows, pressing coins into palms, slipping back into respectability by dawn. Picture the preachers, the reformers, the novelists, all writing their versions of the story. And picture us, walking among them, listening, watching, trying to understand. The story of Victorian London's underworld is not only theirs. It is ours too. It is the story of how a society builds its morality on contradictions, how it hides its hungers in shadows, how it sacrifices the powerless to protect the powerful. It is the story of how compassion flickers even in darkness, how reform rises even amid hypocrisy, how silence is never complete. And now, as the lamps gutter and the fog deepens, our walk must end. The city grows still, its voices fading. The brothels are quiet, the streets empty, the last carriages rolling home. But the echoes remain, the footsteps in alleys, the whispers in clubs, the cries in hospital wards. They linger in the stones, in the river's murmur, in the very air. So let us leave them here, these ghosts of London, not forgotten, but remembered in their contradictions. And as the night settles, may these echoes guide you gently into thought, into reflection, perhaps even into dreams. For the shadow of Victorian morality has not passed. It lies beside us still, soft as fog, heavy as silence, endless as the city itself.